Salvasai piantasai il chu sim, cinque ragas Apache implorano un cowboy solitario. Jacob Donovan rode alone across the vast desert landscape, the sun beating down relentlessly on his weathered face. His horse, a sturdy chestnut mare named Rosie, moved steadily over the dry, cracked earth, kicking up small clouds of dust behind them. The wind, dry and hot, whistled through the cacti and the occasional low bush, but the desert always seemed silent, as if it held its breath in a quiet, unbroken pause. It was the kind of silence that made a man feel small, like a single grain of sand in an endless stretch of dunes. Jacob had grown accustomed to this life, wandering from place to place without ever really belonging. He wasn't much for company, and after the war he preferred solitude. The war had taken its toll on him, leaving scars deeper than the ones on his skin. He wasn't a man who believed in much, but the land, the silence, and the steady rhythm of his horse kept him grounded. For years, Jacob had been running from his past, from the memories of battles fought, friends lost, and mistakes made. The Civil War had ended, but the scars it left on him had not. After the war, Jacob had taken to cattle ranching, living on his own and keeping to himself. No family, no friends, just the wide, empty expanse of the desert. But even the desert couldn't hide from the world forever. The wind carried whispers of violence, of settlements encroaching on land that had once been Apache territory. Jacob had heard the rumors about ranchers and settlers pushing into the heart of Apache lands, fighting over water, grazing rights, and land. It was only a matter of time before the conflict would reach his quiet little corner of the world. One morning, as Jacob rode his usual path across the rugged terrain, something strange caught his eye. At first, it was just a flicker of movement, something out of place, like a shadow in the distance. It wasn't the kind of shadow cast by a coyote or a hawk soaring high above. This was different, something human. Curious, Jacob rode closer, his instincts on high alert. As he crested a small hill, he saw the remnants of what had once been a small Apache village. The campfires had long since gone cold, and the ashes of their fires were scattered on the ground. Tattered blankets and broken pieces of cooking pots were strewn about, a silent testament to the destruction that had taken place here. The scent of smoke still lingered in the air, mingling with the dry desert dust. Jacob's heart sank. He knew what had happened here. The settlers had done this. They had come in the night, raiding the village, killing the men, and taking what they could. He had heard about these raids, but he never thought they would reach him. He had always kept to himself, staying out of trouble, but this was different. Suddenly, a low sound broke the silence, something soft, almost like a whisper. Jacob turned, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun, but he quickly relaxed when he saw the figure emerging from behind a cluster of rocks. It was a woman, her face painted with ash and dirt, her clothes torn and stained. She moved slowly, as if every step took all her strength. Her eyes locked onto Jacob, and he could see the fear and desperation in them. Jacob hesitated. He wasn't a man who believed in saving anyone. He had learned the hard way that you couldn't trust anyone, especially not when their survival depended on you. But something in the woman's eyes, something raw and vulnerable, made him pause. "Are you?" Jacob started, but his voice faltered. The woman's appearance startled him. She looked like she had been through hell. She raised a hand, her fingers trembling, and in broken English she spoke. "Help us, please." Whatever it was, he couldn't turn his back on her. "Where are the others?" he asked, his voice more gruff than he intended. The woman pointed toward the nearby canyon, her eyes wide with fear. "There, others hide." As they approached the canyon, Jacob's eyes scanned the landscape, looking for any sign of danger. But the canyon seemed quiet, too quiet. Suddenly, a rustling noise came from behind a cluster of rocks. Jacob tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle, but before he could react, 5 more women appeared. They were all young, no older than 20, each with a look of fear and exhaustion on their faces. Some had dirt streaked across their cheeks, and others had their hair tied up in ragged knots, but all of them had one thing in common, the same desperate look in their eyes. The woman who had spoken earlier gestured toward them. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, "we need help. We are alone now. Our people are gone. Help us survive," one of the women spoke. Her voice was soft but filled with an undeniable strength. She looked directly at Jacob, her eyes fierce despite her weariness. "Protect us. Help us keep our people alive." But these women, their plea wasn't just for their lives. It was for something much deeper, something sacred. "Why me?" Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why ask me?" This wasn't just about survival. It was about something deeper, something that connected them all. The desperation in their eyes was real, but there was also something else there, something ancient. Jacob didn't understand it, but he felt it. He wasn't just a man on horseback anymore. He was being drawn into something larger, something beyond his control. The women gathered around him, their faces filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. They weren't asking for much, just a chance to survive, to keep their culture alive, to protect what was left of their people. Jacob knew that agreeing to help them would change everything. He would no longer be a man wandering the desert, alone and detached from the world. He would become a part of their world, a world he didn't fully understand. For a moment he wondered if he should just leave, ride away, and let them figure things out on their own. But as he looked into their eyes, something inside him stirred. A sense of duty, perhaps, or maybe just the remnants of the man he had once been before the war had hardened him. With a sigh, he spoke. "I'll help. But you need to understand, I don't know what you're asking of me. I'm not your savior." The desert, with its vastness and silence, spoke enough for him. But as he stood there, surrounded by the 5 Apache women, he realized that his quiet life was about to be broken open. These women were asking something of him, something he wasn't sure he could give. After their initial meeting, the women led Jacob deeper into the canyon. The heat of the day seemed to stretch on forever, but they moved with purpose, despite their exhaustion. The woman who had first spoken, the one with the piercing eyes and a voice that trembled with a mix of fear and strength, introduced herself as Ayana. Her name, meaning eternal bloom, seemed to fit her quiet resilience. The other women introduced themselves too. Tala, a woman with a sharp, intense gaze, Nashoba, who carried herself with a kind of dignity. Even in their dire situation, Yiska, the youngest of the group, who still had traces of childhood innocence in her eyes. And finally, Shima, a woman whose calmness contrasted with the turbulent emotions in the air. They didn't speak much as they walked, but there was a quiet understanding among them. Jacob could feel it, a bond between the women that went beyond words, a shared history, a shared grief. The land, too, seemed to speak in the wind and the quiet rustling of the bushes. It was as if the desert knew what had happened here, knew the pain these women carried with them. The canyon was sheltered, a small oasis hidden from view, but it was clear it would not be enough to protect them for long. The women's camp was simple, only a few makeshift tents and a small fire pit. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and sweat, the remains of their struggle to survive. Jacob's first instinct was to offer them a way out, to help them escape to a safer place. But deep down, he knew that the world outside the canyon was not kind, especially to people like them. The women's lives had been upended in the worst possible way. Their village, once thriving with the rhythm of their culture, had been reduced to ashes. The men had been killed, the children scattered, and now it was just these 5 women, fighting not just for their own lives but for the survival of their people's legacy. Gianna, the eldest of the group, sat down by the fire and gestured for Jacob to join them. He hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. He had never been one for ceremonial things, never been part of a community that had rituals or traditions. But these women were different. They were part of something that went beyond survival. They were connected to something ancient, something sacred. The firelight flickered, casting shadows on their faces, and for the first time in a long while Jacob felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt since before the war. "We must discuss what comes next," Yana said quietly, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "You have offered to help us, but this will not be an easy path. You will not simply be a protector, Jacob Donovan. You will be part of our survival, in more ways than one. The land has chosen you. You have been brought here for a reason. We do not ask for your leadership but your strength. We need someone to fight alongside us, someone who will help us rebuild, even if only for a time. But there is more. The land requires more. We ask for something deeper than just survival. There is a sacred bond that ties us to the earth, to the spirits of our ancestors. It is said that when the people are in danger, a protector will come, a man who will carry the strength of the earth within him. That man is you. I'm no man of legend. I'm just a cowboy trying to survive," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Yana continued, undeterred by his words. "You must understand, Jacob, it is not just your protection that we seek. You are meant to help us continue our line, to renew our bond with the earth. Our people are no longer many, and we must ensure that we survive. To do that, we must unite with the land once again." They were speaking of a deep spiritual need, a need that reached far beyond anything he had ever been a part of. "I don't know if I'm the man you think I am," Jacob said, his voice low, filled with uncertainty. "I'm no leader. I'm no shaman. Our people have always been connected to the earth, Jacob. You will be our bridge back to that connection." These women, however, offered him something different, a chance to be part of something greater than himself. "I don't know if I can give you what you need," he admitted, "but I will help you however I can. And in time, you will understand what that means." The land, the women, and the history of their people had called to him, and though he didn't fully understand why, he could not ignore it. As night began to fall, the group settled around the fire. Jacob couldn't help but feel a strange sense of responsibility weighing on him. He was no longer just a man passing through the desert. He was now part of something much bigger, something he couldn't walk away from even if he tried. The women's quiet presence around him was both comforting and unsettling. They were asking him to join them in something much larger than just survival. They were asking him to become part of their future, their legacy. Jacob lay awake that night, staring at the stars overhead. The silence of the desert was now more than just peaceful. It felt heavy, like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. He had agreed to help these women, but he had no idea what he was truly getting into. What would it mean to protect them, to become part of their culture? And what would it mean to stand by them as they fought for their survival and for the survival of their people? He didn't have the answers, but for the first time in years, Jacob didn't feel as alone. The desert, which had once been his only companion, now felt like it was waiting, watching, ready to reveal the path he was meant to walk. Jacob spent the next few days with the women, learning more about their ways and their culture, though there was still so much he didn't understand. The canyon, with its steep walls and shaded ravines, felt like a safe haven for now, but Jacob couldn't ignore the nagging thought that their refuge wouldn't last. The settlers were moving further into Apache territory, and he knew that the conflict between them was only going to escalate. The land was vast, but the settlers' hunger for it was greater. He had seen it before, how men, driven by greed or desperation, would stop at nothing to claim what wasn't theirs. The women weren't just fighting for their survival, they were fighting for their entire way of life. Yana, the eldest of the women, had spoken of their ancestors, of the long line of warriors and leaders who had fought to protect their people. The Apache had always been a nomadic people, connected to the land in a way that Jacob couldn't quite comprehend. They didn't see the land as something to own, but something to be part of, a living, breathing entity. It was this deep connection that gave them strength, even when everything else seemed to be slipping away. As Jacob spent more time with the women, he began to understand the weight of their request. They had asked him to protect them, yes, but they had also asked him to become part of their future. They needed him to help them rebuild, to help their people survive. It was a responsibility that Jacob had never considered, and though he didn't fully understand what it meant to plant his seed, he knew it was something deeply significant. The desert itself seemed to grow heavier with every passing day. The heat of the sun, the stillness of the air, and the quiet rustling of the wind in the canyon all spoke of an approaching storm. Jacob had lived in the desert long enough to know that nothing ever stayed still for long. The stillness was only an illusion. The women, too, seemed to sense it. They would gather around the fire at night, speaking in low tones in their native tongue. Jacob had picked up some of their words, but the language was still foreign to him. He often found himself watching them, trying to understand their customs, their beliefs. The way they moved, the way they spoke, the way they looked at the world, it was all so different from the life he had known. Gianna, ever the leader, took Jacob aside one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the canyon walls. "Jacob," she began, her voice steady, "I know you are unsure of this path we have set before you, but I want you to understand that this is not a burden. It is a calling. I don't believe in destiny or fate. I just try to survive. I've spent so many years running from my past, trying to forget things I've done. I don't know how to protect you in the way you need." But these women, they had cracked through his tough exterior. They made him question his choices, his past, and what the future could hold. They made him feel like he could be part of something bigger than himself. But that didn't mean the road ahead would be easy. He knew the settlers weren't far off. He had seen their smoke in the distance, heard the rumors of their brutal raids. There was no way to avoid the conflict forever. The women would need to defend themselves, and they would need to do it soon. The time for hiding was running out. Jacob had been trained to fight, though it was a skill he had long buried deep inside him. His time as a soldier had left him with enough knowledge to know how to defend himself, but he hadn't fired a gun in years. Now it seemed he would have to pick up that skill once more, but this time the stakes were higher. This wasn't just about his own survival. This was about the survival of a people, of a culture that had been fighting for its existence for centuries. The women didn't shy away from the task at hand. They were warriors in their own right, having lived through countless battles and hardships. Jacob began to see that their strength wasn't just in their ability to fight. It was in their ability to endure, to keep going even when the odds were against them. Tala, the woman with the intense gaze, was particularly skilled with a bow. She taught Jacob how to shoot, patiently guiding his hands as he aimed at targets in the distance. At first his aim was shaky, but with Tala's quiet encouragement he grew more confident. She had an air of quiet determination, and Jacob began to see that she wasn't just training him. She was teaching him something deeper, something that went beyond physical skills. She was teaching him how to be patient, how to wait for the right moment. Nashoba, the dignified one, had a different way of teaching. She didn't use words as much as the others, but there was a quiet strength in her presence. She showed Jacob how to move through the desert, how to find water in the driest of places, how to read the signs of the land. She taught him how to survive without relying on modern tools or comforts. In a way, she was teaching him how to become part of the land itself, to feel its rhythms, to understand its language. Yiska, the youngest, had a fire in her that reminded Jacob of his own youth. She was eager to prove herself, often pushing herself to the limit during training. She was quick, agile, and determined. Jacob couldn't help but admire her spirit, even if he sometimes had to rein her in. There was a wildness about her that was both inspiring and dangerous. Shima, the calmest of them all, was the one who spoke least, but her actions spoke volumes. She would sit by the fire, weaving intricate patterns into baskets and blankets, her hands moving with a steady rhythm. Jacob noticed that whenever Shima was around, the atmosphere seemed to calm, the tension of the day easing into something quieter, more peaceful. She had a way of reminding him that there was balance in all things, even in the middle of chaos. As the days passed, Jacob began to feel a strange sense of camaraderie with the women. They weren't just strangers he had stumbled upon, they were becoming his family. He still didn't fully understand their customs, their beliefs, but he felt something in his chest that told him he was meant to be here, meant to help them. He couldn't quite put it into words, but he could feel it in the way his heart beat when he saw them working together, in the way his hands itched to pick up a rifle and protect them. One evening, as they gathered around the fire, Ayanna spoke again, her voice serious but filled with determination. "The settlers are coming. We can feel it in the air. They will not stop until they have what they want. We cannot wait any longer. We'll fight." The next few days were a blur of preparation. They gathered weapons, checked their traps, and stocked up on food and water. Jacob helped with everything, though he could sense the tension growing between the women. It wasn't just the impending attack that had them on edge. It was something deeper, something that Jacob couldn't quite put his finger on. They were preparing for a battle, not just for their lives, but for the future of their people. And in that battle, Jacob was no longer just a cowboy. He was part of their tribe, part of their legacy. The desert stretched out before them, silent and still, but Jacob knew that the quiet was only temporary. The storm was coming. And when it did, they would stand together, ready to face whatever came their way. Jacob had never been one to put much stock in old legends or spiritual rituals. To him, survival had always been a matter of practicality, of finding food, keeping safe, and moving on. But as he spent more time with the 5 Apache women, he began to realize that survival was something much deeper than mere existence. It was about connection. Connection to the land, to the ancestors, and to each other. And in a way, Jacob was being drawn into something much larger than himself, a force he couldn't fully understand, but one that pulled at him all the same. The days had grown longer, the sun beating down on them as they prepared for what was coming. The settlers were still a threat, their presence looming on the horizon like a storm cloud. Jacob had learned to read the signs of the land, just as the women had taught him, but there was something else he couldn't ignore, the bond that was forming between him and the women. It wasn't just about their physical survival anymore. It was about their future, their culture, and their way of life. Ayanna had spoken to him of the sacred bond between man and woman, how it was more than just a physical connection, it was a spiritual one. In their culture, the union of a man and woman was seen as an act of reverence to the earth itself, a way of ensuring that the people would continue and that the land would be remembered. At first, Jacob had brushed aside the idea. He wasn't sure if he could be a part of something so sacred, something so deeply tied to a culture that wasn't his own. But the longer he stayed with them, the more he began to understand. The women weren't asking for him to be their savior. They weren't asking him to take on a role he couldn't fulfill. They were asking him to join them in a shared responsibility, to become part of their family, their people. They were asking him to help them survive, not just by protecting them from the settlers, but by ensuring that their future would not be erased. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the canyon, Ayanna pulled Jacob aside. She had an air of seriousness about her that he had come to recognize. Her eyes were steady, her voice calm but firm. "Jacob," she said softly, "I know you are uncertain. You are not sure if you can be part of this life, part of this people, but I want you to understand that it is not a choice. The earth has chosen you, and whether you accept it or not, you are part of our future now. I don't know if I can live up to what you're asking of me." But these women had shown him something different. They had shown him the strength of their culture, their history, and their unwavering bond to the earth. And though he wasn't sure he was the right man for the job, he knew that he couldn't leave them. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. "Tell me what I need to do," Jacob said, his voice low, filled with a mixture of uncertainty and determination. Ayanna smiled slightly, a glimmer of approval in her eyes. "It is not something you do, Jacob. It is something you accept. You are already a part of us, whether you know it or not. But the land requires a sacred union, a joining of hearts and spirits. When you accept that, when you truly understand it, then you will know what to do." Maybe it was about joining them in something more profound, a shared responsibility to each other and to the land. Over the next few days, the tension between the women grew stronger. They were preparing for the inevitable attack from the settlers, but they were also preparing for something else. Jacob could feel it in the air, an energy, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with weapons or tactics. It was as if the women were preparing for a spiritual ritual, one that would bind them to each other and to the land in a way that was both personal and sacred. The night before the settlers were expected to arrive, the women gathered around the fire as they had many times before. But tonight was different. There was a quiet solemnity in the air, an unspoken understanding that this night would mark a turning point. The fire flickered in the darkness, casting long shadows on the canyon walls, and the women sat close together, their faces illuminated by the warm glow. Jacob sat beside Ayanna, his heart beating faster than usual. He didn't know what was about to happen, but he could feel the weight of the moment. The women began to chant softly, their voices a low hum that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. It was a rhythm, a song of the earth, of the ancestors, of the land that had sustained them for generations. Jacob closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. There was something ancient in their voices, something that resonated deep within him. He didn't know what it was, but it made him feel as if he was part of something much larger than he had ever imagined. It was as if the earth itself was speaking to him, calling him to fulfill a role he had never planned for. The fire crackled, sending up sparks into the night sky, and Jacob could feel the heat of it on his face. It was the warmth of the land, the warmth of the people he had come to care for. Ayanna reached out and took his hand, her grip firm yet gentle. "Jacob," she said softly, "we are not asking for you to become someone you are not. We are asking you to become part of what we have always been. You are already a part of us, whether you realize it or not." It was a role he hadn't expected, but one he was beginning to accept. The chanting grew louder, and the women stood, moving with grace and purpose. They formed a circle around the fire, their hands raised to the sky as if offering themselves to the stars. Jacob stood with them, feeling a connection he couldn't explain, as if the very air around them had thickened with meaning. Ayanna turned to him, her eyes filled with a deep understanding. "This is our way, Jacob," she said, her voice filled with quiet reverence. "This is how we survive. Through union, through the sacred bond of man and woman, of earth and sky. You have been chosen, and together we will face what comes." He had never felt that he was part of something sacred. But now, standing in the midst of these women, these warriors, he felt the weight of their legacy. He wasn't just a cowboy anymore. He wasn't just a man wandering through the desert. He was part of something much larger, something that transcended time, something that connected him to the land, to the earth, and to the ancestors who had fought and bled to protect it. As the chanting reached its peak, Ayanna stepped forward and placed her hand on Jacob's chest. Her touch was light, but it burned with a warmth that seemed to ignite something deep inside him. "We stand together now," she said. "We will fight not just for survival but for the future, for our people, for the land." The fire burned brightly, casting its light across the desert, and Jacob stood among them, ready to face whatever came next. He wasn't just protecting them anymore. He was part of them. And whatever the settlers brought, whatever challenges lay ahead, he would stand with them, united, strong, and bound by a bond that nothing could break. The days leading up to the settlers' arrival were filled with tense preparation. The air seemed thick with an unspoken understanding. The women had gathered everything they would need: arrows, knives, and a few old rifles that had been passed down through generations. Jacob had helped them fortify their camp, building makeshift defenses along the canyon's edge. He had worked side by side with the women, and though they never said it outright, he could see that they had begun to trust him fully. They had asked for his help, and in return they had offered him something far more precious: a place among them. The canyon, though a natural fortress, could only hide them for so long. Jacob knew the settlers wouldn't stop. The land they had claimed was more than just land. It was a symbol, a prize that meant survival for some and extinction for others. The settlers weren't just fighting for food or water. They were fighting to take everything from those who had lived on that land for centuries. Jacob had witnessed this kind of hunger before, but this time he couldn't look away. He had made a choice, and now it was time to face the consequences. Gianna had spoken to him the night before, her words lingering in the air between them. "Tomorrow, Jacob," she had said, her voice calm yet full of resolve. "We face what is coming. There is no turning back now, but you are ready. I see it in you." Was he truly ready for this? For a fight that would not just determine their survival, but the future of a people who had already lost so much? The world was about to change, and Jacob knew that he would play a part in it. But would it be enough? He wasn't sure. That morning, the sun rose slowly, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The canyon was silent, save for the occasional rustling of the wind. Jacob could hear the quiet hum of life all around them, the song of birds in the distance, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was the kind of silence that comes just before a storm, heavy with anticipation. Gianna gathered the women around the fire, the morning light turning her face into a mask of resolve. "Today," she said, "we stand together. We fight not for war, but for the future, for the land, for the ancestors who watch over us, and for the children who will come after us." They weren't afraid, not of the settlers, not of what was to come. They were ready to protect their home, to defend everything they held dear. Jacob felt the weight of their gaze upon him, but this time there was no hesitation in his heart. He was ready, not because he was strong, not because he had all the answers, but because he had finally accepted what he was a part of. He was no longer an outsider looking in. He was part of this land, part of these women, part of this fight. He had found something worth fighting for. As the women prepared their weapons and checked their gear, Jacob stepped aside for a moment. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind as it swept through the canyon. It was a sound that had become familiar, a sound that now felt like home. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to remember why he had come here in the first place, the peace he had sought, the solitude he had craved. But now, that peace felt distant, like a memory of someone else's life. He wasn't just a man passing through anymore. He had a purpose. And that purpose was to protect these women, to protect their way of life, and to fight for the survival of something far older than he had ever realized. Iana walked over to him, her footsteps quiet but firm. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him, looking out over the canyon. Jacob glanced at her, seeing the same resolve in her eyes that he had seen in the other women. She was not afraid. "You know what will happen if we don't stop them," Iana said softly, her voice steady. "They will come, and they will take everything, not just our lives but our culture, our way of life. That's why you're here." The settlers were coming. Jacob grabbed his rifle, the familiar weight of it in his hands grounding him in the present. He had used rifles before, in the war and in the years since, but this felt different. This wasn't a battle for land or money. This wasn't a fight between two sides with no clear end in sight. This was about survival. This was about the future of a people, and Jacob would not let them be erased. He took his place next to Ayana, feeling the weight of the moment settling over him. She looked at him once more, her eyes filled with a quiet determination that mirrored his own. There was no fear in her, only a deep, abiding strength that had been passed down through generations. She had no intention of letting the settlers take what was hers, and Jacob could feel that resolve in his own bones. The first settlers appeared on horseback, their figures silhouetted against the bright sun. There were only a few of them at first, but Jacob knew that more would be coming. They were looking for something, and they wouldn't stop until they found it. The women, too, were watching carefully, waiting for the right moment to strike. Yana raised her hand, signaling the start of the attack. The women moved swiftly, their arrows flying through the air with precision. Jacob fired his rifle, hitting one of the riders with a well-aimed shot. The sound of the gunfire echoed through the canyon, followed by the cries of the settlers as they scrambled to regroup. But it was too late. The women were already on them, moving with a speed and agility that left the settlers disoriented. Jacob fought alongside them, his movements instinctive. He had learned to survive on his own, but now, fighting with the women, he realized how much he had underestimated their strength. They were not just survivors, they were warriors, and together they were unstoppable. The battle raged for what felt like hours. The heat of the day bore down on them, but it didn't matter. Jacob had long since lost track of time. All that mattered was the fight. All that mattered was protecting these women, this land, and everything they had worked so hard to preserve. As the last of the settlers fled, defeated and broken, Jacob stood with Ayanna, his breath coming in heavy gasps. The canyon was quiet now, save for the sound of the wind. The battle was over, but Jacob knew that their fight was far from finished. The settlers would not give up easily, and there were many more who would come, eager to claim what wasn't theirs. But for now, they had won. The women had stood strong, and Jacob had stood with them. He had become part of their fight, part of their survival. And as the sun set over the canyon, casting a golden light on the land, Jacob knew that he had found a new home, a place where he truly belonged. The fight was not over, but for the first time in a long while, Jacob felt a sense of peace. He had found his place in the world, and with these women he would protect it, no matter what came next.